Let's go.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Sara Strope and I am the Chief Marketing Officer at QuotaPath, and I'm excited to be joined by Graham. Graham, you want to tell us a little bit about your role at QuotaPath?
Yeah, for sure. So my title at QuotaPath is Chief of Staff, and I feel like I've done pretty much every role at QuotaPath. I've been with the company for about 5 years. So I am currently running our sales team, but prior to that was running our marketing team until you came in and took over, took over my job for me. Prior to that, I was running partnerships. I've also done RevOps. I've done customer success, sales, pretty much everything in the company.
Kind of a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
But you have a real expertise when it comes to sales comp plans, and that's what we wanted to dig into a little bit today. And in fact, your title isn't 100% Chief of Staff. I heard that part of your title is Resident Sales Nerd. Please tell me, how on earth did you get that title?
Yeah, Resident Sales Nerd. So I've referred to myself as a sales nerd for quite some time, in addition to being like just a general nerd of playing board games and video games and whatnot. I've worked in sales for over a decade now and have always been pretty good at sales, but I've been very good at maximizing my commission checks generally because I understand sales compensation plans. I think part of it comes from that RevOps background as well. But I've been able to maximize my earnings by doing a deep dive into sales compensation plans. And then with QuotaPath, I actually have been helping customers and prospects think through exactly how to build their compensation plans because I've seen so many of them as being a part of QuotaPath early on. I have an understanding of what's good and what isn't good.
About how many comp plan consultations do you think you've done in the last, let's say, 3 years?
The last 3 years, probably close to 500.
Close to 500 comp plans. So you've seen a real spectrum from companies just getting started to very large companies. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, is how do you scale as your team scales? What do you have to think about with your comp plan? So it sounds like you've maybe heard a couple war stories, learned some lessons along the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen comp plans where it's one seller, they're hiring their first seller, they need to build their very first comp plan all the way to 1,000 plus sellers, and they're just making small tweaks or trying to even do a complete redesign.
Okay, well before we get into what we should consider as we scale a sales team and all the complexity that reigns with scaling sales teams, let's dig into the basics, because I hear starting at the beginning is a very good place to start.
Yeah.
So what are the foundations that everyone here should keep in mind for a great sales compensation plan?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a big rule of threes guy. And so I have a couple of sets of rules around this. And so one of the rules is that your sales compensation plans should be simple, logical, and fair. So they should be simple. And you're like, well, Graham, you work for a sales compensation platform. Well, don't you want it complex so that it's necessary? But no, that isn't the case. You really want your plan to be simple as possible. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to be paid 10% flat commission on every deal they close. You can add components to it, but keeping that mindset of simplicity in mind.
Should be able to explain it at a dinner party, perhaps.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And then logical. It should be understandable as to why you're doing the things that you're doing. So if you pay more for 2-year deals than you do for 1-year deals, you should be able to explain exactly why that is. It should be logical. You should say, well, we want 2-year deals because the customer sticks around with us for longer. And then fair is that it needs to be equitable. It needs to be equitable for the sales team. They need to feel like they are getting their fair share of the work that they're doing, but it also has to be fair to the company. The company has to make sure that it's a sustainable model for themselves so that they can continue paying the sales rep that.
The logical piece, going back to that, it also feels like that's really important to making sure that the comp plan matches what your business goals and targets are too. So not only is it simple to explain, but it makes sense for what the company is striving to do. What are a couple of things that you've heard, especially in the course of the past year, where people are trying to match to conditions in the market with their comp plans?
Yeah, one I already alluded to, which is the contract length. So a big thing historically has been grow at all costs. Now it's a sustainable growth. And one of the ways to do that is to hang on to the customers that you have. or getting these new customers. It's a lot more work right now, and so we want to hang on to them for as long as we can. And so we're seeing a sharp increase in multi-year contracts and paying for multi-year contracts. Companies are realizing, hey, if I can sign a company for 2 or 3 or 4 years instead of just 1 year, well, that's guaranteed revenue. Now, I may not have those price increases as readily each year. However, I'd much rather just hang on to that revenue year over year. And so that's one thing, is that more and more we're seeing increases in commission rates for multi-year deals.
Great, great. And that last piece in terms of fairness, I imagine that really starts to be a little bit of a sticking point as sales teams grow in size and complexity. When you think about those 3 components of being simple, logical, and fair, is it fairness that gets to be the hardest part as things scale, or is it kind of a combination of all of them? What would you say?
It's a combination of all of them, but I would actually say simplicity is the one that goes out the window first. The larger you get, the more you add in other departments who are involved in creating the compensation plan. And our research has shown that if you include additional departments in the creation of the comp plans, you actually increase the trust in those comp plans. So we usually recommend having more than one department. So whether it's sales and RevOps, or sales, RevOps, and finance, if you can include all 3 of those, you're actually going to have the most trustworthy or reliable comp plans. But with that comes complexity, because the finance team may want something that they, we have to pay on cash received, and then the sales team wants something else, and then the RevOps team wants something. And so you end up having all of these complexities. And so while fairness it gets harder and harder over time, complexity is what really gets hard over time.
Great. I'm so happy you mentioned that research too. Just a quick plug. We just completed our annual compensation trends survey and report. It's being published in early October. And so for those of you in the audience or listening to this later on, you can get early access to our compensation trends report. It's a survey of 450 finance, sales, and RevOps leaders talking about how they gain alignment and trust in building those comp plans. So, okay, if complexity starts to reign as you scale your team, let's talk and let's dig into these kind of 3 components or 3 kind of pieces. Let's talk first about territories, then I want to talk about leadership and the complexity that brings, and finally, let's talk about kind of sales adjacent teams, because as your sales team is growing, it's very likely that you have adjacent teams that are growing too, right? There's more specialization as your company grows, so maybe that's adding in BDR teams or splitting out, AM teams who focus on expansion and upsell.
Yeah.
So let's dig in first. Territories. So as a team grows in size, what would you say once you get over 50 reps, 100 reps, you probably start to think breaking up the team into different types of territories, whether it's geography or product. How does that impact comp plans?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I think about territories, generally people think of territories as like, oh, I cover the Northeast or the Southwest or whatever. That's kind of an antiquated way of thinking about it, in my opinion. Unless you are an outside sales team, it doesn't necessarily make sense to segment based on location. Unless you need to be in those locations, it doesn't make sense. And so when I think about territories, I often think about like verticals.
Yep.
So one person handles hospitality while another person handles higher education or what have you. But then another one is that customer size or
Yep.
some other way of
Yep.
segmenting. So I know that, for example, HubSpot, we're at the Inbound conference, HubSpot breaks theirs into like small business, and then they have like a mid-market, an enterprise, and then a corporate. And so that's how they segment theirs. And so you say, 50, 100, I don't necessarily think there is a company size or a sales team size that it makes sense to segment. Obviously, you have to have at least 2 people in order to segment. You can't just do it with one sales rep, but it's once you have those distinct differences in the sales cycle and in the customer expectations, that's when it makes sense to segment and to create those territories, if you will. And so I don't think it necessarily is team size, but it is based on differences in the buying and selling cycles.
Okay. So then how does that impact comp plan? Do different sellers in different territories wind up having different comp plans? Can everybody have the same comp plan no matter what vertical they're selling to or no matter how long the sales cycle is?
Yeah. So going to another one of my rule of threes, when you are building a comp plan, you have to answer 3 questions. You have to answer how much you're paying somebody. So what is their base versus their variable? What is their on-target earnings? For what? So what is their quota? How much is it? How often is it? And then how, which is what is the structure of their plan? Do they have commissions or bonuses or whatnot? And so each one of those are going to be different by those segmentations as well. So generally, the higher up you go in a segment, or so higher employee count tends to have higher contract values, which means that generally the person is paid more because more is expected of them. With quotas, again, as you move into higher contract values, you tend to see longer quota periods. So what I mean by that is, as opposed to a monthly quota, you may have a quarterly quota or even an annual quota.
Which would make sense for those enterprise sales.
Exactly.
Right?
As you have, if you're only closing 10 deals a year, it doesn't make sense to have a monthly quota for that person.
Right. And that would be very different from a team that was segmented, as you mentioned, based on the size of the company they're selling to.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. If you're closing $2,000 deals and you're closing 20 of them a month, then yes, absolutely, you should be on a monthly quota. But if you're closing 10 deals a year, you should be on an annual quota.
Right. Great. So that helps us think, as we're scaling our team and thinking about how we're organizing them by vertical, by kind of market segment size, or if necessary, the antiquated kind of geography, how we start to have some differences in the comp plans. It sounds like you can still keep it fairly straightforward, though. Let's talk about, there's this added level of complexity, though, when your team does start growing in size and you start to have layers of management. I read a study recently from Insight Partners that found that on average, the kind of span of control is about 6 to 8 sales reps per manager or director. So now you start to think about a team of sales reps, that's 10s, 20s, hundreds, and wow, that's probably not only managers, but then directors and VPs, so there are probably a lot of layers. Do they all get a slice of the pie too? What do their compensation plans look like?
Yeah, so they do tend to get a slice of the pie. And as you increase the size of the team, comp plans change drastically, because we recommend keeping the entire commission pool to about 20 to 25% of the deal value. So early on, you may be paying your sales rep 15% of every deal they close, and that's okay because they're the only ones getting paid on it, maybe the VP or the sales leader at the time. But at my previous company, so you had mentioned BDRs, and we'll talk about that. I ran about a 45-person BDR team.
It's a pretty big BDR team.
It was, yeah. We had 4 managers and 40 reps and myself, and we had, but at that previous company, 7 people were paid on every single deal that closed, because you had the sales rep, their manager, the director, the VP, the BDR, their manager, and myself, the director. And so we had 7 people getting paid on every deal that closed. And so you can't pay the sales rep 15% there, right? You have to lower that so that you can give slices to each person. And each person gets paid essentially on how close they are to that revenue. And so the VP of sales gets paid substantially less on every single deal than the sales rep or their manager does. But yes, where they have you had said span of control, where they have that span of control, they should be paid on the work that is done there. And so for a manager, oftentimes they're paid on every deal that their sales team closes. A director, every deal that's closed on their, maybe they have 4 managers under them, and then the VP is on everything. And so as you scale, more and more people are paid on that, which means that each person has to get a lower percentage.
What are some ways you've seen people actually pay some of the leadership? Like, is it a standard commission rate, or are they starting to look at maybe the total book of business, or like a team-based bonus? What are some differences that you've seen?
Yeah, there are a few things. So the higher up in the organization you get, the closer you are aligned to the overall financial model. Generally, there's a financial model approved by a board or designed by the finance organization. And so your VP isn't necessarily paid based on the quota. They're paid based off of the financial model. And it's their responsibility to reasonably build a team that can achieve that financial model. And so that may mean promotions, or it may mean hiring or expanding the team in a hopefully a sustainable way. And so that's often the case, and you also end up seeing buffers within those plans. And what I mean by that is a sales manager may not be held to, say they have, I'm going to make my numbers easy here, 5 reps, each with a $200,000 quota. They may not be held to that whole $1 million quota. They may be given a buffer of 10 to 20%, and so they may only be held to 90% of that, or $900,000. And the reason being, there's a lot of variability within a team, but the flip side of that is you also tend to see what we call floors, which is to say, or cliffs, which is to say, you may not earn anything if your team ends at 50%. You may have a 60, 70% floor where your team has to hit 60 or 70% for you to actually get paid anything. Because if your team is overall achieving 40%, you're not going to get paid on that.
Right. So now you're actually designing a compensation plan for the manager, director, VP that helps them meet the overall team goals and company goals as opposed to individual goals.
That's right.
Yeah. So now when we go back to like plans should be simple, logical, and fair, it still is, but now you have kind of multiple versions of that.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, and another thing is to be sure that you're aligning the incentives for the leadership with the sales team. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes, I talked about multi-year agreements, oftentimes the sales reps are paid more for multi-year agreements, but then the sales leaders are not. And if the sales leaders are not, generally you see a discount for multi-year deals. And so it's actually detrimental for the sales leader to sign a multi-year deal because they get paid less because the deal value is lower, whereas the sales rep gets paid more. And so now you have this push and pull where a sales leader is like, no, I don't want you to sign a 2-year deal. And a sales rep is like, well, all I want to do are sign 2 and 3-year deals.
Interesting bit of conflict there. Yeah. So how would you design to kind of caution against that? Or how do you look
Be intentional about it. I mean, and that's why we call it Comptober. The month of October tends to be when people start building those compensation plans. Comptober, looking at all of your plans holistically as opposed to just looking at your sales team's plans or just looking at your BDR's plans. We have to take them all in context, and is everybody aligned towards the same goal? So creating this goal, sales compensation is the caboose, not the engine. You have to have a company-wide target, a company-wide goal. We want to increase our retention. We want to increase our ARR, whatever that may be, and ensuring that each of those compensation plans are going towards that mutual shared goal.
I really love that. That's a great takeaway as you're scaling. Like kind of keep all the players in mind. So don't let it be an afterthought, of, oh, well, we just need to, I think a lot of times you're thinking, oh, well, we absolutely need to hire, 5 more AEs. And you're not thinking, oh, and one more. And when we do that, you should start with that end in mind of like, and we need to relook at the comp plans for everybody all together. I really like that. That's right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about one last component here of scaling teams is like the adjacent teams. As you scale, you start to see more specialization, right? And it's no longer the one AE who's maybe doing everything and getting all of the commission. Maybe you started to break out expansion into a different role and renewals into a different role. So what does that start to look like? Tell us about some of the other teams and their comp plans that you see as teams scale.
Yeah, so on the new business side, the most common kind of second role that you'll hire on the new business team is a BDR. So BDR, business development rep. They're also called SDRs or MDRs or LDRs. There's all kinds.
XDR,
XDR, exactly. Just whatever. Their responsibility is creating opportunities that are then handed to the sales organization for them to generally run demos and close deals. And so that tends to be the second role that you hire for in the new business team outside of management. And I see those plans being built a bunch of different ways, but really what you're trying to do is you're trying to balance how much they have control over it. So what is the XDR's control versus the intrinsic benefit to the business. So I joke that the simplest would just be, well, you pay them $1 for every cold call they make. They have a ton of control over that, right? I can go in and make 100 cold calls, make $100, but I could just be dialing, 8675309 100 times, and there's no intrinsic benefit to the company. And so if you want to also compensate based on the benefit to the company, oftentimes we see based on the number of demos held early on as you're figuring out, first meetings held or whatever it may be. As you're building a plan early on, all you want is just number of meetings so that I can figure out what's good, what's not good. Then you move into a qualified opportunity model generally, where, hey, these meet some specific qualifications to say that this is a good opportunity for us. And then sometimes people also pay based on the actual revenue derived from those opportunities. That's a harder one, especially if you have a longer sales cycle or more people involved. But those tend to be the models that I see for XDRs.
Great. So that creates a really nice kind of collaboration on the new business side, and now a different type of component that you need to create. So now we've gone from maybe our AE plans and their manager plans and leadership plans to now adding in building a comp plan for the BDR, SDR role. What about on the kind of existing business side? What are the roles that you see coming into play, and how do you build comp plans for them?
Yeah, so this is where I get into my discussion about leading indicators versus lagging indicators. More often than not, people focus pretty much exclusively on lagging indicators, meaning did they renew? Now that's fine, and it's not bad. That's actually probably the way to do it, but you have to keep in mind that sometimes there are leading indicators as well. So like number of meetings held, or how quickly they were onboarded, or what their NPS scores are, those things that determine the success of the customer long term. It's easy to say you get paid 1% of any renewal that comes in, but if you don't know your business well, or you're a really early on organization, if you do that, you may not know why those people renewed, or you can't predict that they're going to be renewals. And so it may make sense early to say, yes, you get paid 1%, but you also get paid based on how quickly they were onboarded, or how many QBRs you have with those people.
I was just in a session yesterday with Guide CX, and they had a stat, I feel like it was something about 98% of customers who have a good onboarding experience and a fast onboarding experience renew. And so that onboarding delivery time, as you mentioned, that could be a component. It's not often one that we pay on when we think about customer success or account management teams. As you mentioned, we're often thinking about did they renew or not. So it's interesting to think about what are those other drivers and how do you build that into a plan.
Yeah.
What about in terms of expansion and upsell?
So expansion and upsell is its own separate boat. Oftentimes you see those roles, rolling up to the new business team. And sometimes there is a separate expansion team, and sometimes it's handled by the CSM or the account manager. A lot of it just depends on your business and how your customers want to buy. And really that's what it comes down to, is making it easier for the customers to buy and keeping this customer-centric mindset of how do the customers want to buy, what is the easiest, least friction for them. Adding in a whole nother person can be jarring and can be confusing unless there's a reason to do it. And if you sell, 15 different line items or different product lines, you may have to have a specialist in each one of those if there are lots of different capabilities within each of those.
Right.
However, if you're only selling one product line, like a lot of SaaS companies are, oftentimes adding in an expansion rep can be jarring, and it isn't the most appealing component to the sales team or to the buyer, and there's really no reason for it.
Yeah. So really keeping that customer in mind. It also goes back to your principles of keeping it simple. So keep it simple and logical for your customers as much as you do for your reps and the rest of your team.
That's right.
I love it. Well, Graham, I think you really set a good framework for folks as they think about scaling their team. Hopefully everyone keeps those components in mind. 3 components to start with?
Yep, simple, logical, and fair.
Great. And then as we scale your team, think about territories, leadership, and
ancillary roles. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking with you this morning.
Let's give Graham and Sara a round of applause. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you guys for being with us. Really appreciate it. I know that you got one coffee. Feel free to grab another one.